She came off the train in Harwick, Montana, with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter, and the letter was from a man she had never met who was offering her a job she wasn't qualified for. And she had taken the train anyway, because the alternative was staying in Chicago, in a room she couldn't pay for, in a city that had taken everything she came with. Her name was Delia Strand. She was 29 years old. She had been a bookkeeper for 11 years at a grain trading firm on the South Side, until the firm's owner died in February, and his son came in from Cincinnati, looked at the ledgers, looked at the staff, and decided he could run leaner. She'd been given 2 weeks' notice and a handshake that she didn't return. She had enough saved to last 3 months if she was careful, and she had been careful, and it had lasted 4, and then it had not lasted anymore. The letter had come through a placement agency on LaSalle Street that handled domestic and clerical positions in Western territories. It was brief to the point of being terse. The writer had a freight and supply operation in Harwick, in the Bitterroot Valley, and needed someone who could manage accounts and correspondence. He had specified capable, steady, no complications. The agency had apparently matched those requirements to Delia without asking her much about herself, which was fine, because she didn't have much to say. The man's name was Gideon Marsh. The letter was signed with that name and a business address on Mill Street in Harwick, and nothing else. She'd written back accepting the position before she'd fully decided to. That was also fine. Deciding afterward was something she had learned to do. Harwick in April was cold in a way Chicago was not cold. Chicago was wind and damp, and a particular misery that was personal about it somehow. This was just cold, clear, and total, the kind that came down off the mountains to the west without apology and sat on the valley floor until it was ready to leave. The town was small. A main street, maybe 8 blocks, a mill at the north end that gave the town its industry and part of its name, a handful of cross streets with houses set back from them. The mountains showed above everything, still white at the tops, and the sky was the kind of blue that didn't exist east of the Rockies. She stood outside the station with her carpetbag and looked at it all for a moment. Then she walked to Mill Street. The freight office was a 2-story building of timber and brick, with a loading yard behind it, and a sign above the door that read Marsh Supply CO in plain letters. A man was crossing the yard with a hand truck stacked with crates when she came through the gate, and he stopped and looked at her with the expression of someone who hadn't been told to expect anyone. "I'm here to see Mr. Marsh," she said. He pointed at the door. Inside, the front room was an office of the functional variety. 2 desks, a long counter, shelves along one wall stacked with ledger books and invoices, a pot-bellied stove that was doing its job. A young man at the nearer desk looked up when she came in. Behind him, through an open doorway, she could hear someone moving. "Miss Strand?" The young man stood. "Yes?" "Mr. Marsh said to send you straight back." She went through. Gideon Marsh was standing at a work table covered in manifests when she came in. He was not what she'd pictured, though she hadn't pictured much. He was tall and lean, somewhere past 40, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for a long time and showed it. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that was set by habit rather than expression. He looked up when she entered, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to decide if it matches what he was told. "Miss Strand." Not a question. He didn't extend his hand. "Sit down." There was a chair across from the work table. She sat in it. "The agency said you were in grain accounting," he said. 11 years. That's not freight." "No," she said. "But ledgers are ledgers. The commodities change. The arithmetic isn't." He looked at her for another moment, then back at the manifest in his hand. "I have an office man who does the day-to-day. What I need is someone who can manage the contract accounts and the correspondence with suppliers in Missoula and Portland. Quarterly reconciliations. I'm behind on 2 quarters. "How far behind?" he told her. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was further behind than a business of this size should have been. "Do you have a system, or were you working from paper?" she said. "Paper. I can establish a system. It'll take 3 weeks to set up properly, then maintenance is straightforward." He set the manifest down and looked at her again. "Where are you staying?" "I was hoping you could direct me somewhere." "Mrs. Tillman on Spruce Street takes in boarders. I'll send a note ahead." He picked up the manifest again. "You start Monday." "The rate is what the agency quoted." She stood. "I'll need access to all the paper records from the past 2 years." "You'll have it." She walked back through the front office and out into the April cold, and she stood for a moment in the yard with the mountains in her line of sight, and she thought that whatever this was, it was a beginning. She had learned not to ask more than that from beginnings. Mrs. Tillman's house was clean and warm, and served supper at 6 without exceptions, which Delia respected. Her room was small and faced the back garden where nothing was growing yet, but the soil had been turned and was ready. She unpacked her carpetbag, hung her 2 good dresses, and sat on the edge of the bed for a while with her hands in her lap, doing the arithmetic of the new situation. The job would cover the room and leave enough to save. The work was the kind she knew. The town was small, which meant fewer variables. It was manageable. She was good at managing the manageable. She started Monday and had the records sorted by category by Wednesday and the first ledger system drafted by Friday. Marsh looked at it without expression on Friday afternoon and said nothing for a full minute. "You did all of this in 1 week," he said. "I worked evenings." He made a sound that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite dismissal. Then he said, "The Portland account is more complicated than what's in those files. I assumed it might be. There's history with the Portland supplier that isn't documented. Then you'd better tell me what it is," he told her. It was, in fact, more complicated, involving a dispute over a delayed shipment in the fall of the previous year that had soured the relationship and resulted in a penalty charge that Marsh believed was incorrect and had not paid, and which the Portland supplier was now threatening to escalate. The amount in question was not small. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "Do you have the original contract terms?" "Somewhere. Find them. If the penalty clause was triggered, we need to know the exact language. If it wasn't, we have grounds to dispute. Either way, sitting on it doesn't help you." He looked at her with the same expression she'd seen in his office on the first day, the measuring look. "I've been sitting on it for 4 months," he said. "I know. I can see it in the ledgers." Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. Not quite a reaction. More like a recalibration. "I'll find the contract," he said. She nodded and went back to the front office, and the young man at the other desk, whose name was Perry, and who was 23, and had been with Marsh Supply for 2 years, watched her sit down, with the look of someone who was revising an opinion in real time. "He never talks about the Portland account," Perry said. "He did this afternoon," she said. Perry looked back at his work. The first month established the shape of things. She was at the office at 8 and left at 5, except on the evenings she stayed late with the ledgers, which she didn't announce, and which Marsh noticed without commenting on. She established the quarterly system and began working backward through the backlog with the systematic patience of someone who had done this for years and understood that you couldn't rush reconciliation without missing something that would surface later at a worse moment. Marsh was in and out of the office. He managed the freight operations directly, which meant he was often in the yard or out on the routes, and the office ran in his absence without difficulty, which seemed to be the point. He kept his own counsel. He didn't ask her questions beyond what the work required. She offered no more than that in return. The Portland contract came back in favor of Marsh Supply. She'd found the penalty clause, read it carefully, compared it to the delivery documentation, and concluded that the terms had not been met by the Portland supplier's own definition. She wrote the letter to the Portland firm herself, in precise and friendly language, and showed it to Marsh before she sent it. He read it twice. "You're sure about the clause?" "Yes." "They'll push back, probably, but they'll push back from a weaker position." He handed the letter back. "Send it." They settled 2 weeks later for a figure that canceled the penalty and added a credit toward the next quarter's order. It was not a dramatic victory, but it was a clean one. Perry heard about it and told her with the unguarded enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting to see how things would shake out. "He was worried about that account for months," Perry said. "He didn't show it, but I could tell." "Most people don't show it," she said. She had been in Harwick for 6 weeks when she met Garrett Mull. He was not someone she met so much as someone who appeared, the way certain men appeared in small towns, with the ease of a person who had arranged the local geography to his own convenience. He came into the Marsh Supply office on a Thursday morning in May, bypassed Perry entirely, and knocked on the open door of the back room where Delia was working on the second quarterly ledger. "You'd be the bookkeeper," he said. She looked up. He was in his mid-40s, well-dressed for Harwick, with the face of a man who smiled often enough that it had become a kind of instrument rather than a reflex. He was carrying a hat in one hand, turning it at the brim. "I'm the accountant," she said. "Right." The smile didn't change. "Is Gideon in?" "He's in the yard. Perry can get him. I'll just wait here if you don't mind." He leaned against the door frame. "You came from Chicago, I heard." "You heard correctly. Long way to come." "Yes." He waited, clearly expecting more than that, and when she didn't provide it, the smile shifted slightly, becoming more effortful. Marsh came in from the yard a few minutes later and saw Mull in the doorway, and something in his face closed down in the specific way a man's face closes when he sees someone he was not hoping to see today. "Garrett," he said, not warmly. "Gideon. Thought we might talk about the Sawmill Creek contract. My office." They went. She could hear the conversation in parts through the thin wall, not words but register, and Mull's register was the pleasant, persistent tone of a man who believed that good humor was its own kind of pressure. Marsh's was flat and short. After 20 minutes, Mull left through the front, and Marsh appeared in the doorway of the back room. "Do you know who that is?" he said. "No, Garrett Mull owns the other freight operation in this valley. He's been trying to absorb Marsh Supply for 3 years." She set her pen down. "Through acquisition, through whatever's available." Marsh's voice was even, but his hands were not entirely still. "He's made 3 offers. I've declined all of them. Last year, he tried to hire away 2 of my drivers. The year before that, he had a conversation with my Portland supplier that I believe contributed to that penalty dispute. She absorbed this, and the Sawmill Creek contract. Timber operation north of town. New account. Mull wants it, so do I." He looked at her directly, which he didn't always do. "If he gets it, I lose the North Valley routes. That's 20% of my current volume. What's the status? I'm presenting next week. So is he. What does your presentation look like?" he told her. It was solid on the operational side and thin on the financial side, which was the part that a timber operations management would look at most carefully. "I can put together the financial analysis," she said. "Rates, projections, comparison against standard market terms. Something they can read in 20 minutes and trust." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a significant amount of work. I know what it is." Why? She wasn't entirely sure why he'd ask that. It seemed to her like a straightforward part of the job. "Because it's what you need," she said. He stood in the doorway for another moment, and then went back to his office without saying anything more, which she had come to understand was his version of agreement. She worked 3 evenings on the financial analysis. Perry stayed late with her on the second evening without being asked, pulling records she needed from the storage shelves, and she began to understand that Perry's loyalties were uncomplicated and that he was a better asset to the operation than he was probably told often enough. "How long has Mr. Marsh had this business?" she asked him on the second evening. 12 years, Perry said. "Built it from 1 wagon and a mule, and Mull came in 8 years ago with backing from investors in Helena. He's got twice the fleet, but..." Perry paused. "The operators up north prefer Marsh. He's got a reputation for delivering what he says when he says it. Mull's faster on paper and slower in practice. That should be in the presentation," she said. "How? Testimonials, letters from current clients, verifiable track records on delivery timelines. Something a timber manager can read and confirm if he wants to." She looked at the ledger. "Can you put together a list of accounts who'd write a letter on short notice?" Perry thought about it. 6 or 7. "Yeah. Do it tomorrow." He did. By Friday, she had the full package. Financial analysis, market rate comparisons, client testimony, 5-year projections under 3 scenarios. She set it on Marsh's desk Friday afternoon. He read it in her presence, which he hadn't done with anything else she'd produced. He went through it page by page without expression, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at the window for a moment. "This is thorough," he said. "It's what they need to make a decision. Mull will have something polished. His people are good at that." "Polished isn't the same as accurate," she said. "If they're experienced operators, they'll know the difference." He looked at her. "You're confident about it." "I'm accurate about it," she said. "Confidence is something else." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile, but it was something adjacent. She found out about the Sawmill Creek contract on a Tuesday morning, when Perry came in 15 minutes before she did, and was waiting at the front door with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "He got it," Perry said. She nodded. 12-year contract, Perry said, with the barely contained energy of someone trying to maintain appropriate composure about very good news. The manager said our presentation was the clearest thing they'd seen. She hung up her coat. Good. Mole was there too. He had a whole presentation, color maps, and everything. She sat down at her desk. What did they say about his? Perry grinned, that it was very attractive. She allowed herself a small amount of satisfaction, not because she needed to be credited, but because the thing she'd done had worked, and she'd known it would, and there was a particular quiet pleasure in that kind of knowing. Marsh came in at 9 with no announcement. He stopped in the front office, which he didn't usually do. You've heard, he said. Perry told me. He looked at her for a moment with the measuring expression that she'd come to understand was not assessment exactly, but something more like he was deciding how much to say. They cited the financial analysis specifically, he said. I know. You could have told me it was that strong. I told you it was accurate. He stood there for another moment. Then he said, Come in the back when you have a minute. She followed him in. He had his coat still on, which meant he'd stopped here first instead of going to the yard. I owe you a better explanation of what's at stake with Mull, he said. He sat down across from his own desk, which she'd never seen him do. He usually stood at the work table. This isn't just competition. He's been buying out smaller operations all along the valley. 2 in the past 18 months. The owners took his offers because they were tired, or because he'd made it hard enough to keep going that selling was easier than fighting. He manufactured the difficulty, she said. In some cases. Marsh looked at his hands. My brother had an operation in the Flathead. Mull made him an offer 3 years ago. He turned it down. 6 months later, his 2 best drivers left for Mull's outfit. Then a major client didn't renew. Then the spring flooding took out a road they used, and the repairs took 4 months, and by then the client had moved on. He paused. Martin sold in the fall. He moved to Oregon. She sat with that for a moment. The shape of it was clear. Has he done anything directly actionable here? She said. The Portland situation was close. I can't prove it. You don't need to prove it to prepare for it, she said. He looked up. You need to know your vulnerabilities before he does, she said. The drivers, the client relationships, the supply routes. What could he disrupt if he decided to? If I know the financial exposure, I can map it. Marsh was quiet. Outside in the yard, someone was backing a wagon and calling instructions. That's not what I hired you to do, he said. I know, she said. It's what I'm offering to do. He studied her. Why? Because Martin sold in the fall and moved to Oregon, she said simply. And that seems like the kind of thing that could have gone differently. He held her gaze for a longer moment than he usually did. Then he said, I'll pull the route maps. She nodded. What she did not know, and what did not surface until the following month, was that the ledgers had a problem she hadn't made and hadn't seen yet because it was in a set of records that predated her hire and had been kept separately in a locked cabinet in Marsh's private office. She found out about it sideways, the way you found out about most things in a small office. Perry, on a Friday afternoon in June, mentioned offhandedly that the quarterly filing with the Territory Bank was going to be different this year. She asked him why. He went vague, which was unusual for Perry, who was not a vague person. She waited until the end of the day, and then she knocked on Marsh's office door. He was at the work table. He looked up and read something in her face, and something in his own face shifted. Sit down, he said. What's in the locked cabinet, she said. A pause. He didn't look surprised that she'd asked, which surprised her. Sit down, he said again, and this time it was not a direction so much as a request. She sat. The locked cabinet contained, it turned out, a second set of accounts. Not falsified. Nothing criminal, but a separate line of credit taken out against the business 2 years earlier, before she'd arrived, when the Portland dispute was at its worst, and the winter roots had been poor 2 seasons in a row. He'd borrowed against the company to cover payroll and operating costs, and the loan was structured in a way that didn't appear in the main ledgers because it had been handled through a private arrangement with a lender in Missoula rather than through the Territory Bank. The amount was not small. The repayment schedule was, in her assessment, aggressive for the current revenue flow. She sat with that for a while after he'd told her. You weren't going to tell me, she said. I was going to tell you before the quarterly. The quarterly is in 3 weeks. Yes. She looked at the cabinet. Is there anything else in there? No. She believed him, and she examined why she believed him, and the examination held up. Why the private lender, she said. Because the Territory Bank would have required collateral I wasn't sure I could secure. The private arrangement was faster and didn't require documentation that would have shown up in Mull's credit inquiries. He paused. He monitors the public filings. She absorbed this. The logic was sound, even if the outcome was complicated. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right. I need to see the full loan documentation. All of it. Then I need to work through what the quarterly looks like with this factored in, and whether the repayment schedule is workable given the Sawmill Creek revenue that's coming in. I should have told you in May, he said. When you were working on the presentation? Yes, she said. You should have. He didn't apologize, which she hadn't expected, but he said it straightforwardly, which she respected more than an apology would have been. I wasn't sure yet, he said. What you were, she looked at him. What I was. Whether you were someone who could know that and handle it, or someone who would use it. She understood that. She sat with it for a moment and examined how she felt about it, and the examination turned up something complicated and something simple. The simple part was that she understood the caution. The complicated part was that she'd spent 6 weeks building something here, and apparently hadn't done enough of it where it needed to be built. I understand the caution, she said. I don't share the conclusion. I can see that now. Give me the documentation, she said. He did. She spent the weekend with it. Not at the office, at Mrs. Tillman's, at the small desk in her room where the south light came in the afternoons. She went through the loan terms with the focused patience she brought to things that were difficult and that needed to be gotten right. She ran the numbers 3 ways. She mapped the Sawmill Creek payment schedule against the loan repayment schedule and found the place where they intersected, and it was tighter than comfortable, but it was not impossible. On Monday morning, she laid it out for Marsh on his work table. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was what he did when he was actually paying attention rather than waiting. Here's the problem, she said. The repayment peaks in October. The Sawmill Creek payments start in July, but the first large installment is November. You're short in October by this amount. She pointed to the figure. It's bridgeable if you accelerate receivables collection on 2 accounts that are currently running late. She pointed to those. If they pay in September rather than December, you clear the October bridge by a margin of about $900. Marsh looked at the accounts she'd indicated. Harlow and Dent, he said. Both have been clients for over 5 years. Perry says they pay late as a habit, but they pay. They do. If you write to them directly and explain that you're reorganizing your payment terms and requesting settlement by September 30, most long-standing clients will accommodate it. And if they don't, then we find the $900 somewhere else. There are options. They're less clean, but they exist. He stood at the work table with his hands flat on either side of the papers and looked at it all for a moment. You're not angry, he said. She looked at him. Should I be? Most people would be. Getting angry about information I've already received doesn't improve the information, she said. It just costs me time I could spend on fixing the problem. He looked at her the way he had the afternoon after the Sawmill Creek contract. Not the measuring look. The other one. Martin would have figured this out eventually, she said. Your brother, if he'd had someone going through the books. Marsh straightened. You don't know that. No, she said. But I know what I can see in a ledger, and what I can see in a ledger is that the problems that sink businesses aren't usually the ones people can't solve. They're the ones people don't see until they're bigger than the solution. He was quiet for a moment. Write to Harlow and Dent, she said. I'll draft the letters if you want. Draft them, he said. She did. They both replied within 2 weeks. Harlow settled in full in August. Dent wrote back requesting an extension to October 15, which was close enough and which Marsh granted. The October bridge was covered. The quarterly filed clean. The day after the filing, Marsh came into the front office at midday, which he almost never did at midday. Are you free for supper this evening, he said. She looked up from the ledger. Yes, there's a restaurant on 2nd Street, 6 o'clock. He went back to the yard. Perry watched the whole thing from his desk with the expression of a person who was carefully not reacting. The restaurant was quiet on a Wednesday evening. They sat across from each other over decent beef stew and bread, and she thought about how little of the shape of a thing you could predict from the beginning of it. 4 months ago, she had been in a room in Chicago she couldn't pay for, and now she was sitting across from a man whose accounts she had pulled back from the edge of a fall, and it was not what she would have written down, if she'd been asked to write down what came next. You could have taken a position in Missoula, Marsh said. Or Helena. Why Harwick? It was the first position that came back. That's all. She thought about it. I didn't have the luxury of being particular, she said. I had the money for one move, and I made it. He was quiet for a moment. I wrote to the agency because I needed someone fast. I told them I wanted someone steady and no complications. They told me. You're steady, he said. The complications part is harder to evaluate. She waited, because there was more coming, and she could tell. Garrett Mull came to see me last week, he said, while you were in Missoula for the supplier meeting. She hadn't known that. He knows about the private loan, Marsh said. His voice was even. Someone in the Missoula lender's office talked. He knows the amount, the terms, and the October repayment window. He was very pleasant about it. He picked up his coffee cup. He offered to buy out the loan and restructure it as an acquisition agreement. The room was quiet around them. She could hear the kitchen through the swing door, the particular sound of a working kitchen. What did you tell him? She said. I told him I'd think about it. And he looked at her. I've thought about it. She waited. The answer is no, he said. But no isn't enough. He'll try another angle. He always does. He set the cup down. I need to know what the next angle is before he finds it. Then we need to find it first, she said. He looked at her. You say we as though this is your problem. She considered that. There was a version of this where it wasn't, where she was a hired accountant, and the question of whether Marsh Supply survived Garrett Mull's campaign was above her station and beyond her scope. There was another version where she had spent 4 months learning this operation from the ledger out, and she understood it better than she had understood anything in years. And the thought of watching it come apart because a well-funded man with a habit of wearing people down had decided it was the next thing he wanted was something she found she wasn't willing to sit still for. If Mull absorbs Marsh Supply, I don't have a position, she said. He'll have his own people. Marsh looked at her steadily. Is that why? She met his eyes. No, she said, but it's a reason. He held her gaze for a moment, and something passed in his expression that she didn't try to interpret too directly. All right, he said. Tell me what you'd do, she told him. It took most of the evening. She laid out the logic the way she laid out a ledger, sequentially, without decoration, each step contingent on the one before. She had been thinking about it since Monday, since she'd understood what the Missoula information leak meant and where it pointed. The strategy was not complicated. It was systematic. Identify every point of exposure. Eliminate the ones that could be eliminated. Fortify the ones that couldn't. Make Mull's acquisition target harder to absorb than it was worth. The Harlow and Dent letters had been the first move, though she hadn't known it at the time. Clean October Bridge meant the loan was not a lever he could pull. Client relationships needed strengthening before he could erode them. The Sawmill Creek contract needed to be performing visibly, loudly, in the way that attracted other timber operators in the North Valley who might be weighing their options. You've been working on this, he said. I've been thinking about it. Since when? Since Perry mentioned the quarterly would be different, she said. He sat back in his chair. The restaurant was quieter now. The dinner crowd thinned out. Why didn't you tell me you were thinking about it? I didn't know enough yet, and now, I know enough to know what I don't know, she said. You'll have to fill in the parts about the client relationships. I can do the financial mapping, but the relational part is yours. He nodded. Not agreement exactly. Acknowledgement. They stayed for another hour. He told her about the North Valley clients, which ones were stable, and which ones he'd been less certain of, which ones Mull had approached before. She listened with the focused attention she brought to new information that had to be retained accurately. When they left, the October air had come in cold, and the mountains were invisible in the dark, but somehow still present, the way they always were. I'd like to show you the North Valley route, he said, standing outside the restaurant. If you're going to map the exposure, you should understand the geography. All right, she said. Saturday, he said. She nodded. He walked one way, and she walked the other, and she thought, on the walk back to Mrs. Tillman's, that this was how things changed. Not in the dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of the ordinary ones. The Harlow letter, the October Bridge, the restaurant, the mention of Saturday. Each one was just the next thing. But the next things were adding up to something, and she was honest enough with herself to know that she wasn't entirely sure what. She went on the North Valley route on Saturday, and then she went the Saturday after that. And by the third Saturday, it was not because of the route mapping, but because it was Saturday and she expected to go, and he did not suggest otherwise. The route took 3 hours by wagon. It ran north through the valley floor, and then up into the lower foothills where the timber operations were, and the views from that elevation showed the whole valley below, the river running silver through the bottom of it, the town small in the distance. She understood, up there, why a person would come here and stay. Marsh did not talk much on those drives. He pointed out the relevant geography, the road conditions, the features that mattered operationally. Occasionally, he said something about the land itself, the way a man who had been looking at something for long enough began to see more than its uses. On the third drive, she asked him how he'd come to freight. "My father ran a supply route in Minnesota," he said. "I worked it with him from the time I was 12. And Montana. I came out when I was 26. There was more room here." He was quiet for a moment. "Martin followed me out 8 years later. You were close?" He looked at the road. "Close enough." She left that alone. Mull's next move came in October, through the Harwick Town Council. He proposed a new route permitting system that would have required freight operations to pay per route fees that would have been manageable for a large operation and difficult for a smaller one. Delia found out about the proposal from Perry, who heard it from his uncle who was on the council, and she went to Marsh's office with the relevant municipal code book open in her hand. "He can do this," she said. "The council has the authority, but only if no one contests it with a financial impact analysis." Marsh looked at the book. "How long do I have?" "The hearing is in 3 weeks. She wrote the financial impact analysis in 4 days. It was 12 pages, and it was thorough enough that 2 other small freight operators in the valley, who she had not met and who had no particular reason to trust her, came to the council hearing and read their own supporting statements. One of them, a woman named Inez Garber, who ran a 3-wagon operation out of the south end of the valley, shook her hand outside the council chambers afterward and said, "I heard you put this together." "Yes, you saved us a significant amount of money," Inez said. "You would have found it eventually, maybe," Inez said, "but you found it first." The proposal was tabled indefinitely. Mull left the council chambers with the same pleasant expression he always had, which was, she had come to understand, the expression of a man who was already working out what came next. What came next arrived in November, in the form of a letter from a land company in Helena, proposing to purchase the commercial property on Mill Street that housed the Marsh supply offices and yard. The letter was addressed to the property's current owner, who was not Marsh, who leased the building. Delia found out about it because Marsh came into the office on a Tuesday morning and set the letter on her desk without saying anything. She read it. The Helena Company was offering the building owner, an elderly widow named Mrs. Calloway who lived in Missoula, a price that was 15% above market value. The letter did not mention who was behind the Helena Company, but the timing and the pattern were legible. "If Mrs. Calloway sells," she said, "the new owner can set new lease terms," Marsh said, "or not renew. What's your current lease term?" "Month to month." It was never formalized past the original. He sat down, which he still didn't do often. "I've been here 12 years, and I never pushed her to formalize it." She thought about that for a moment. "Does she need the money?" "I don't know. Do you know her?" "We've met twice. She knew my father. She gave me the original lease on a handshake." She looked at the letter. "Write to her," she said. "Not about this letter. About the lease. Tell her you'd like to formalize it. Long term. Offer fair value. I can't match 15% over market." "You don't have to match it," she said. "You have to be the person she already has a relationship with. That's worth something. It depends on what she wants." He wrote the letter that afternoon. She read it before he sent it. It was not a long letter. It said what it needed to say, and it didn't dress it up, which was characteristic of him, and which was, she thought, exactly right. Mrs. Calloway wrote back in 10 days. She had, she said, received another inquiry about the property, and had intended to respond. She had been meaning to formalize the lease arrangement for some time, and would welcome the opportunity to do so properly. She would have her attorney in Missoula prepare the documentation. The lease was formalized in December, 15 years with renewal options. Marsh told her about the letter from Mrs. Calloway on the afternoon it arrived, coming into the front office with it in his hand, and reading her the relevant portion in a manner that was matter-of-fact, and did not attempt to conceal that he was, beneath the flatness of his delivery, relieved. "You suggested the right approach," he said. "You knew her," she said. "I just said to use what you had." He stood in the front office for a moment longer than the information required. Perry appeared to be absorbed in something on his desk. "Are you free this evening?" Marsh said. She looked up. "Yes." He nodded. He went back to his office. Perry kept his eyes on his work. They ate at the 2nd Street restaurant again, and the evening was cold enough that their breath showed when they walked to and from it. And the mountains were white all the way down now, which was different from the mountains she'd seen in April, and from every set of mountains she'd seen before, which was to say she had seen none. "You've been here 8 months," he said. "Yes. Are you staying?" She thought about how to answer that, and whether the honest answer was the same as the useful answer, and decided they were the same. "I don't have anywhere more important to go," she said. He looked at her. "That's not the same as staying." "No," she said. "It's the beginning of it." He was quiet. The street outside was empty in the December cold, and the town was settled in for the night the way small towns were, a different quality of quiet than a city. "I want to offer you a partnership stake in the business," he said. It landed between them with the weight of something that had been carried for a while. Not compensation, a stake. Ownership. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you've been building it with me for 8 months, and you don't work like someone who's working for someone else." He held her gaze. "And because Mull will try again, and when he does, I want it to be yours to protect the same way it's mine. Not because I'm paying you, but because you have a reason." She sat with that. The fireplace in the corner of the restaurant was doing its work, and the room was warm, and outside was the cold and the dark and the mountains she hadn't known yet 8 months ago. "A partnership changes things," she said. "Yes," he said, "it does." She understood that he was not only talking about the business, and he understood that she understood. And neither of them said more than that, because they were both people who had learned to be exact about what they meant and to leave the rest for the moments that earned it. "All right," she said. He reached across the table, and they shook hands on it, which was the right way for this particular moment, and they both knew it. And after the handshake, neither of them pulled back quite as quickly as the formality of the gesture required. Spring came back to the valley the way spring came to Montana, reluctantly at first, and then all at once. The snow came off the mountains in sheets. The river ran high. The road to the North Valley was impassable for 2 weeks in April, and then opened again into something that smelled like new ground. The partnership had been filed with the territory in January. It was documented and legal, and listed in the business registration that the territory printed each quarter, and Delia Strand's name appeared in it next to Gideon Marsh's, in the plain typeface of an official record, which she found she liked to look at. For reasons that were not entirely practical, Mull made one more attempt in the spring. He approached the Sawmill Creek timber operation directly, offering to undercut Marsh Supply's rates by 12%. The timber manager, a methodical man named Ira Stuckey, who had become a reliable correspondent over the winter, wrote to Delia before he wrote to Mull, asking whether Marsh Supply could match the offer. She wrote back the same day. She explained that matching the offer wasn't something they'd do, because undercutting their rate by 12% meant either the other party was operating at a loss, or they were cutting somewhere in the service that would show up later. She enclosed 3 years of delivery performance records, which she had compiled and organized the previous fall for exactly this kind of occasion. Stuckey wrote back 4 days later. He said he had reviewed the materials and would be staying with Marsh Supply. He also said, in a postscript that she read twice, that he had appreciated doing business with people who told him the truth in plain language, and that he hoped the arrangement continued for a long while. She set that letter on Marsh's work table. He read the postscript, set it down, and looked at her. "You prepared those delivery records in October," he said. "Yes. For this specific scenario. For a scenario like it." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something closer to appreciation that didn't quite have another outlet. They were married in the summer, on a Friday morning, in the judge's office in Harwick, with Perry and Inez Garber as witnesses. And the whole thing took 20 minutes and was done before the lunch hour. Mrs. Tillman had pressed Delia's good dress the night before, unsolicited, and handed it back to her with the straightforward warmth of a woman who had been rooting for this particular outcome since February and was not ashamed of it. Afterward, they walked back to the office because the contracts didn't stop for personal arrangements. And Perry had put a small bunch of wildflowers on her desk that he claimed came from his mother's yard, and Marsh pretended not to notice them, and she pretended to believe that. The spring after they married, Gideon's brother Martin came back from Oregon. He arrived on a Tuesday with a traveling trunk and the look of a man who had decided something and was still deciding whether it had been the right decision. He was shorter than Gideon and broader, and he had the same jaw set by habit, and he stood in the freight office yard and looked around it with an expression that was hard to read. Gideon introduced them in the yard, and Martin shook her hand and said he'd heard about her, which she gathered was true. "You saved the Portland account," Martin said. "The Portland account saved itself with the right documentation," she said. He looked at her a moment, then at Gideon. "I should have had someone like her in the Flathead." "Yes," Gideon said simply. Martin stayed. He worked the North Valley routes, which were his to know again within a month, and he was steadier than he'd been, Gideon said, on the evenings when they sat on the porch of the house on 3rd Street that Delia had moved her books into after the wedding. Not whole, maybe, but steadying. Sometimes the difference between those two things was enough. Mull made no further moves. Whether he had run out of angles or found another operation to want was not entirely clear. He was still in the valley, still running his fleet, still being pleasant. But Marsh Supply's name was in the Territory Business Registry with 2 names behind it now, and the Sawmill Creek contract was in its 2nd year and performing, and the North Valley operators had started using the freight office as a kind of informal meeting point on Saturday mornings, which was not a thing Delia had planned, but which was the kind of thing that happened when a place earned a reputation for straight dealing over a long enough stretch of time. She sat at the books every morning and managed the accounts and wrote the letters and ran the quarterly reconciliations. And the work was the kind she knew, and she was good at it in the way that comes from years of caring about getting it right. And she was better at it here than she had been in Chicago, because here the numbers were tied to something she could see out the window and walk to and understand from the ground up. In the fall of their 2nd year, a young woman came into the office, asking about the bookkeeping position they had advertised in the Missoula paper. She was 22 and had done 3 years of accounts at a dry goods store in Great Falls and was looking for something larger. She sat across from Delia in the back office with her hands folded and answered every question directly and showed her sample work when asked, and the sample work was accurate, which was the first thing. "Why Harwick?" Delia asked her. "It was the first position that came back," she said. Delia looked at her for a moment. "Can you start Monday?" "Yes," she said. 8 o'clock, Delia said. "You'll need to learn our ledger system. It'll take about 3 weeks." The young woman nodded. She didn't look nervous exactly. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was ready to start with what it brought. Delia understood that. She thought it was probably the most useful thing you could be at the beginning of something. They hired her. She stayed for 9 years and eventually ran the North Valley accounts on her own. And the thing Delia told her, on the 3rd day, when the ledger system was starting to make sense, and the young woman looked up from a page with the expression of someone whose thinking had just changed shape, was the same thing she had learned herself in a cold front office in April, learning a new geography from the numbers up. The work is not separate from the place. If you learn both, you can hold both. And what you can hold, you can keep.